We're very happy this year to have again our good friend, Professor Sergio La Porta from CSU Fresno. And he has been giving lectures in this lecture series, you said today, 9 years, huh? And we haven't kicked you out yet. Pretty good. Okay. He is currently the High and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies at Cal State Fresno. No better place to have him. And prior to that, Professor La Porta was a lecturer in Armenian and religious studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His doctorate was conferred by Harvard University with honors in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. Today, he is presenting a commanding portrayal of the history and the causes of the Armenian Genocide. It's as comprehensive an account of these events as you are likely to hear in less than 2 hours. Listen carefully. Professor La Porta.
There we go. Thank you, Diane. Thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to come to Sonoma State and interact in this class, in this series. I've often found it engaging, always find it engaging, and the questions at the end thought-provoking as well. I'd also like to thank the Alliance for their support, and particularly Christine Davidian, who first brought me here and has managed to continue to do so every year. So I thank everyone involved in this afternoon's lecture. So today, in order to fit in with the topic, I think, for the overall series this semester, I will be presenting a few basic facts about the Armenian Genocide, just so that we're all familiar with it. I will also be talking about some basic facts about Armenian identity, who the Armenians were, where they're from. Again, just so that you realize that this was a civilization, a culture, a people that pre-existed the genocide by many centuries, by millennia, and that with the genocide was not only were 1.5 million people erased, but an entire civilization as well. And we'll look at how the Armenian Genocide fits into what hopefully you've all studied or will study in the class about the paradigm of genocide. The Armenian Genocide is often referred to as the first genocide of the 20th century. That, not entirely accurate, but it is the first, I would say, modern genocide and exhibits the patterning of the paradigm of genocide that would be horrifically emulated in subsequent genocides. And then I'm going to talk about rescuers and survivors, something I've never really touched upon in this, in giving lectures here. Now, I am not of Armenian descent myself. I do not have a personal story of survival of the genocide from one of my relatives. Obviously, by now, pretty much all of the survivors have passed. So it's also hard to get an actual survivor. It's pretty impossible to get an actual survivor to talk about their experiences. And that's one of the problems I'll be talking about later on today. But how do you deal with genocide once all of the victims and the survivors have passed by a century, over a century? And it's something that other genocide survivors will be facing as we move into the future. So it brings up some questions. But I think you are going to have somebody who'll be talking about a personal survival story next week, which should be quite informative as well. So let's begin today's lecture with some basic facts about the genocide. So we normally date the beginning of the Armenian Genocide to April 24th, 1915, when 250 Armenian intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire were arrested, mainly in Constantinople, but not only. And most were soon murdered, and that's normally given as the inception date. There were killings before this. I'll touch upon that later on, but nonetheless, we normally date April 24th as the date also of the commemoration. So every year, the Armenian Genocide is commemorated on April 24th. Between 1915 and 1923, approximately 1.5 million people were killed, murdered, with 800,000 in the first 4 months alone. That's a rate of 200,000 per month. For those of you who may be studying the Rwandan genocide, we notice a same figure per month in that genocide as well. One aspect of genocide is the rapidity with which the killing is done, particularly at the beginning, which makes it very difficult to stop once it's started. The genocide occurred in the Ottoman Empire under the direction of the ruling Committee of Union and Progress, known as the CUP, which was the political party that was ruling at the time. I'll get a little bit into that later on, but it is important to point that out, that the actual leadership of the Ottoman Empire at the time was not really the Ottoman Sultan, but an ultra-nationalist party known as the Committee for Union and Progress. I also like to emphasize that while the Armenian Genocide is a defining moment in Armenian history, it is not the defining moment of Armenian history. As I've already indicated, our earliest mention of Armenia as a historical place dates to the 6th century BCE. Armenians have developed as a culture, have developed a language, I'll talk about this, and a civilization for over 2 millennia. The genocide was definitely a destructive moment that will be remembered, but they have a proud and long history before this, and they will continue to have a long future ahead of them. Unfortunately, however, the actual genocide itself is denied by the Republic of Turkey to this day. That adds another layer of problems when we're talking about rescuers and survivors, because it's hard to be a survivor or a rescuer of an event that didn't officially happen, according to the Turkish government. So this is one of the problems that we're still facing today, and we'll touch upon that as well later on. So those are some basic facts. We'll go into a little bit more into detail as we move along. Turkey may deny it, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen or that other people haven't recognized it. And it's heartening to know that these prestigious institutions, as well as governments, have recognized what happened to the Armenians in 1915 as genocide. So first and foremost, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, who should know what they're talking about, it is their field, and the International Center for Transitional Justice, as well as the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, have all recognized what happened to the Armenians as genocide. Likewise, the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and the World Council of Churches have officially recognized what happened to the Armenians as genocide. And a couple of weeks ago, the Dutch Parliament actually also recognized the Armenian genocide officially. Although the government said it's not official policy, but the Parliament recognized it officially. 27 countries and the Vatican City have officially recognized it. The United States has not recognized it officially at the federal level. And this is where things get complex. In all of these sort of who recognizes what, there's this added level of complexity. But 48 of the states have now recognized in local decrees and region and state decrees that what happened to the Armenians in 1915 was genocide. And this, as you can see, is a monument to the Armenian genocide that was erected at Fresno State thanks to the efforts of the university, the Armenian Studies program there, and especially the community who did the fundraising for this. We're very proud of it. It's quite a lovely structure, and it's meant as it's at the center of the campus, and it's meant as an educational tool as well. So if you're ever in Fresno and on Fresno State's campus, please come and see it. We can also say that there are Turkish scholars, and this is probably the most heartening of all of these recognitions, Turkish scholars who have realized that the Armenian population, the Armenian history in what is today the country of Turkey, is an important factor of their own history, and the policy of their extermination that the Ottoman government undertook in 1915 is also an important part of who they are today, and that they need, in order to understand their own history and their own politic, their own body politic, need to come to grips with it. So there have been a lot of courageous Turkish scholars who have started recently to explore the impact of the Armenian genocide on Turkey. And these are just not Turks, they're also Kurds. I say Turkish scholars, they're Turkish citizens, but ethnically some are Turks and some are also Kurds, who make up the majority of the population now in the area where Armenians used to live. So this has been a welcoming and positive development. I have to say, however, it's also been dangerous for them. I know quite a few who have not been able to return to Turkey because of what they've done, or at least find it very uncomfortable to go back there. Some of them have no problems and go back and are able to use the archives there, but Also, given recent events in the Republic of Turkey under President Erdogan, there have been serious crackdowns both on academia and on journalism that's made it a very unfriendly place to be if you're asking questions that the government doesn't like. Okay. I should also mention that the Armenian Genocide was instrumental in the definition of the word genocide. The word genocide did not exist when the Armenian Genocide happened. Right? It did not exist in 1914 before the genocide. The word was only coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin. So what we have in newspaper articles at the time who are covering the genocide particularly in the years between 1915 and 1922, are attempts by journalists to try and describe the extreme nature of the violence. As we say here, they use phrases like mass killing, attempts at total annihilation, extinction of the people, mass executions. These sorts of phrases occur time and time again in newspaper articles of the time, 1915, 1916, 1917. And so we can see people trying to come to grips with the nature of this, of the killing. But the term itself didn't exist, so they really know how to describe it. But as I said, the term is coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who is a Polish Jewish jurist whose family suffered in the Holocaust. He lost most of his family in the Holocaust, but he himself fled and made it to the United States. And he spent most of his life, even before the Holocaust, studying what he called crimes against humanity. And one of the earliest cases he worked on was the Armenian genocide, and it was instrumental in his own formulation of what constitutes genocide. So we can see, even though the word, and I mention this because some people say, look, you don't find anybody referring to it as a genocide in 1915. Well, it's sort of hard to do that when the word doesn't yet exist. So this is also important to see how it was an instrumental part of the creation of that term. Okay, one other thing I would like to mention is that the victims of the genocide are no longer victims for Armenians, in the sense that in 2015, the centenary, the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the Armenian Apostolic Church canonized the victims, and so they are now saints collectively. And Armenians are no longer supposed to mourn those people who were killed in the genocide. Instead, they're supposed to pray to them in order to guide present-day Armenians into the future. So people are now supposed to look to the victims of the genocide as signposts, as leaders, as inspirers for how people can lead into the future. All right? And it poses a challenge. Obviously, their deaths pose a challenge in terms of how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again. For Armenians particularly, how can they preserve what was lost? How can they move forward? How can they continue to develop despite this having happened? And so they're supposed to turn to the Armenian victims, not anymore as victims, but really as victors. They're the ones who achieved a spiritual victory. They are now saints to whom Armenians can appeal in their prayers. Okay, so what are some significant factors of Armenian self-identity? That is, how does an Armenian self-define? And of course, this will change from person to person, but in general, if you have a conversation with an Armenian, one of the things that they will talk about is their long history. And here's a picture of Mount Ararat, the highest mountain in Asia Minor, or at least in the Near East. It was a volcano, and the area around it is quite volcanic, but this is often considered by Armenians where the homeland of Armenia was, and historic Armenia. Today, Mount Ararat is in the Republic of Turkey. It's not under Armenian control, and so there are no Armenians there. But it is worshipped by Armenians as a symbol of their long history, their independence. They obviously also recognize it as the site where Noah's Ark landed, and so they trace their own ancestry back to after the flood and Noah's Ark. There's also a NATO base on there now, but we don't talk about that so much, but there's a giant radar listening station on Mount Ararat that's supposed to listen in on the Russians. But for the Armenians, really, it also comes with a sense of longing and of loss. You can see Mount Ararat very clearly from the Republic of Armenia. We'll talk about it in a second. And it presents itself there as something that they've lost, but yet also as a reminder of their long and proud past. The other thing is their Christianity. They're very proud of their Christian faith. The Armenian king Tirdad in the beginning of the 4th century was the first king not to accept Christianity, but to make it the official religion of his kingdom. And so we often refer to Armenia as the first nation to accept Christianity. They have their own church. It's known as the Armenian Apostolic Church. It's in communion with the Roman Catholic Church as well as other churches. And it has its own head, the equivalent of a pope, who's known as the Catholicos. And this is the Cathedral of Echmiadzin in the Republic of Armenia, which is the equivalent of the Vatican. So these two elements, long history, their Christian faith, and of course, their language. Right, another very significant factor of their identity. They're very proud of their language. It's a beautiful language. Not only do people still speak it, but they invented an alphabet for it in 406 in order to translate the Bible into Armenian. And that's the alphabet that Armenians still use to this day, 1,600 years later. So we have a continual Armenian literary tradition that dates from the 5th century to today, 1,600 years of literature written in Armenian. So again, these are three, not everything, but three of the major components. And one other one I'll mention is also homeland dispersion identity for contemporary Armenian, right? That most Armenians, nearly all of them, have a very clear sense of a homeland, which is not necessarily where they live. Since most of them live throughout the world, or in Glendale, right, and Los Angeles, Hollywood, right? There's a large portion there, but everyone still has this notion of Armenia, right? This notion of Armenia is not necessarily what today is the Republic of Armenia. And for the most part, when people talk about, especially what we call the diaspora, since most of the people in the diaspora are descendants of genocide survivors or left because of other killings, their idea of their homeland is a no longer existent place. It's what we would call historic Armenia that today is within the Republic of Turkey. And so then when people talk about this Armenian homeland, there's a dialogue that they have between where they are now throughout the world and this sort of imaginative space known as Armenia. For the ones who actually come from the Republic of Armenia, it's a little bit different. They think of the homeland as the Republic of Armenia, but they're also keenly aware of this other sort of imaginative space that no longer exists for them as a place where they can live. And so that's also a very big part of their identity. And people will still identify themselves, right? Even if they've been here for 3 generations, they'll still say things like, I'm Vanetsi, that is, I'm from the region of Van, which is today in Turkey, or Harpertsi, I'm from the town of Harpert, which again is in Turkey. Places they can't go to really now so easily, or that don't have Armenian populations anymore. So that's still very much a notion of their identity. So where is Armenia? I've been mentioning these places. Where is it? Okay, let's first start off with the Republic of Armenia. It's not this big thing. It's this little slice of land here that you can see. It was a Soviet republic up until 1991 when it became independent as the Soviet Union collapsed, along with the neighboring republics. It's in an area that we can call the Caucasus. Some people call it the Transcaucasus, meaning that it's on the southern side of the Caucasus, or you can call it Eastern Anatolia. But that's where the Republic of Armenia is today. You have the Republic of Armenia here, close up, and you also have a breakaway little state called NagornoKarabakh. It does not belong to the Republic of Armenia, but it is ethnically Armenian. And they've declared independence from the Republic of Azerbaijan, with whom they fought a long war, which has still not been resolved. It's still a conflict that is unresolved, but they've set up their own government, their own military, their own currency, and they're not recognized by any other country in the world. So they continue to, including the Republic of Armenia for political reasons, but they've continued to maintain this existence. But you can see it's not the easiest part of the world to live in. They're bordered by Turkey to the west, Azerbaijan to the east, the Republic of Iran to the south, and Georgia to the north. The only country with which I could say that they have good relations with is actually the Republic of Iran. Surprisingly enough, they have very good relations with the Republic of Iran. And really, through this little area here, there is still an embargo on Armenia, but when there was a strict embargo, all sort of energy would come into Armenia from Iran and this little bit of land over there. So it is a complicated situation. It's approximately 11,500 square miles, which isn't very big, and it's about 1/10 the size of what people say when they talk about historical Armenia, and we'll look at that now. So historical Armenia pretty much not only encompasses the Republic of Armenia and this part here, but also goes all the way over to here in the province of Sapastia and this area. And while this may never have been, or very briefly had been a political sort of boundary in the sense that Armenians ruled and controlled and had all of this territory, it has been where we could say that Armenians were the dominant linguistic and cultural group for more than over 2,000 years, or 3,000 years. So it is, in that sense, what we can call historical Armenia may not have been a country as we would think of it, but it was definitely an area of inhabitation and cultural production. So this is what, during the Ottoman period, when the genocide happened, were known as the 6 Armenian provinces. The province of Van, of Bitlis, of Diyarbakir, Kharpert, Erzurum, and Sapastia. Those 6 provinces had Armenian populations in them. In Van, they were the majority. In some of the others, they were plurality of the population. But nonetheless, this is where the majority of the Armenian population resided within the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't the only place they were located, but this is where the majority of them actually did reside. And this is where the majority, although not all of the killing during the genocide occurred as well. Now, so let's look at Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is expanding through the 15th century, 15th century, and then in the early 16th century, it manages to capture that area of land in western, we call Western Armenia, or the eastern part of Turkey, and somewhat incorporates it within the empire. I say somewhat incorporates it. It did not have absolute direct control in any way that we would recognize it today. It was more loosely, taxes were collected and sent to Constantinople, where the Ottoman Sultan was, but for many years, it was not what we would think of as direct control of the land. And because of various factors having to do with lack of law and order, and particularly wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Iranian Safavid Empire, many Armenians start leaving that part of the country and start moving to Constantinople, particularly in the 18th century. Just like many people today are moving to Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, out from the countryside, the rural areas of America, right? So too in the Ottoman Empire, beginning in the 18th century, Armenians start moving towards Constantinople. There were already Armenians there, but they start coming in bigger numbers. And this was clear: if you wanted to make a prosperous future, you needed to get to the cities, right? The major urban centers. And Constantinople was the capital, was the biggest of them all. It would have been an amazing city in the 18th and 19th centuries. I was talking with a friend earlier, and they were saying, imagine what it's like to go from the backwaters of the Ottoman Empire and wind up in America. And I said, I have to say that, for example, my wife is of Armenian descent. For her family that came from Constantinople, imagine what it would have been like to go from one of the best cities in the world to a backwater like America. Because in America in 1915 was not the America of New York of 1915 was not the New York of today, right? It is a multi-ethnic hodgepodge of cultures and peoples, and it must have been great in that sense, but it had nothing of the history, the culture, or the wealth of what Istanbul or Constantinople would have had when they were forced to leave everything behind. So for them, it was definitely a step down when they arrived here. So we have to remember that. This was an exciting place to live. And particularly in the 19th century, it was continuing to grow a growing city, and because of certain reforms, economically, a lot of opportunity was extended to the minorities of the empire, and particularly the Armenians were able to take advantage of these reforms that were meant to help secure the rights of life, property, and meant to improve the education system, meant to improve the transportation system. And so if you're an Armenian in 1860 in Constantinople, you really would find it hard to find a better place to live in many respects. This is the time when modern Armenian literature is born, really around 1850. We start seeing Armenians publish in the language that they spoke. Up until that time, they tended to write and publish in the language that the church still uses to this day, a form of classical Armenian. Just as Latin, maintained its usage in Europe in particular over the centuries, classical Armenian had been the dominant language that Armenians used for literature. Right, even though they spoke different dialects at home. Now the whole sort of vernacular starts arising, literary vernacular. Poems, novels, newspapers galore. Every two-bit town had a newspaper, right, including Fresno, Boston, right? They were also publishing newspapers when they came to the United States. It's an exciting period for Armenians. Plays, theaters, cafes start opening up, and Armenians are involved in all of this. So for an Armenian in the 19th century, Constantinople was an exciting place. Yes, there was discrimination. Yes, there were problems, but so there was everywhere. And looking out, you would say this is like a great place to be, and we're doing very well here. They were the head of the mint. They were the imperial architects. They were the head of the gunpowder mill. They were head of paper mills. So they were successful both financially and culturally within the empire. The provinces, as I said, where they moved out, it was a bit of a different story. These are, again, those 6 provinces. Most of the Armenians, or the mass of the Armenians, they are really agricultural peasants. They're farmers, right? They're not taking advantage of the new cafe that's opened up on the corner. They're still living a basic life that they've been living for centuries. But most problematic is that the reforms have not been implemented or enforced out there. Yes, what they say in Constantinople is everybody should be treated equally. Good luck telling the local ruler that, right, when you don't have a presence there. As I said, centralized control was very, very weak in the Ottoman Empire, right? And the government could write these nice laws. That didn't mean that anybody would be following them. And the Armenians, we get continual complaints from the Armenians back to Constantinople saying, listen, this is the law, nobody is following it. Particularly they're having problem with Kurdish tribesmen who come and steal their livestock, who raid their towns. Right? There are also new groups of other Muslims that are being evicted and kicked out of Europe as the Ottoman Empire starts losing wars against Europe and the European powers take over, particularly in the Balkans, but also as Russia starts to push down in the Caucasus. What do you do with the Muslim populations of those places? Right? Europe was also launching sort of a holy reconquest of places that they thought belonged to Europe. So what do you do with all the people who had either converted or moved there who were Muslim? Well, a lot of them said, we don't want to hang around to have revenge taken on us by the Christian powers. We're going to move back to the largest Muslim power that we know. So they show up in the Ottoman Empire, of whom they were subjects, but they start moving back as the empire contracts. They start going with it, and they need places to stay. What better place to put them than out here, where we don't have to worry about them anymore? So these people too, these resettled refugees from Europe and the Caucasus, are also now adding to the competition for scarce resources in the area. So we see those tensions arise. And what we get overall is a sense of lawlessness and abandonment in the eastern provinces. And this is one of the reasons also that Armenians start to form self-defense organizations and political parties. Right? They start to train to how to protect themselves and protect their families, right? And protect their villages. And outside of the empire, they don't really have political parties in the empire at first. The political parties form outside of the empire in Armenian diaspora communities or dispersed communities, such as in Tbilisi, in Georgia, or in Geneva, or in Paris. where Armenians who are no longer in the Ottoman Empire get together to see, can we have a political platform that will advance the causes of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire? So we get that also developing in the late 19th century as well. And as I said, we also have a population problem. There's a demographic problem that Armenians are only the clear majority in Van. Everywhere else, they're in competition with a lot of other groups, particularly Kurds, all right? But also there are Syrians, we'll talk about them a little bit later, and these other new refugee populations and Turks for resources. So it's not entirely comfortable. Well, Constantinople in the west and the cities, it seems like a very comfortable existence, flourishing existence. Out here, there are more problems having to do with the demographics and economy of the area. So in 1908, not only the Armenians, but really Turks have been fed up with the Ottoman Sultanate. The Sultan at the time, Abdul Hamid II, had been pretty much a crazy person, paranoid. He had launched a series of attacks already in 1895-96 against the Armenians, where between 100 and 200,000 Armenians were killed. Many people left the empire then, came to the United States. William Saroyan's family, for example, came after those massacres and arrived in the United States. And those people wound up being lucky because they weren't there for 1915. But not only Armenians, but also Turks and Arabs and Jews and Greeks were done with Abdul Hamid II by the time we get to 1907, 1908. And they lead a coup where he's overthrown. There is a giant, I would say giant, there is a popular movement within the Ottoman Empire known as the Young Turk movement. And it is advocating for a constitutional form of government, right? They don't mind having a sultan, but they'd like the sultan to be like the King of England or the Queen of England, a figurehead that we have at the top that's nice, who, you know, we can show it in ceremonies, but that the real governing of the empire would be done according to a constitutional law with a parliament, right? And the minorities of the empire participated. Armenians participated in this government. They had representation in it, and it seemed like a good time. Again, a time of hope that the problems that were, I would say, almost endemic to the Ottoman Empire by that time would be resolved, particularly now that the rule of law had been established. However, as I think we know very well in the United States, constitutional democracy is not always the most efficient way of governing, right? It may be the least bad of all forms of government, as Winston Churchill said, right? It's not that democracy is good, it's that everything else is just worse. However, it's not efficient, right? There's arguments, and then you go back, and then people don't agree, so then you have to take another vote, or nothing passes because nobody gets a clear majority. It's messy. It's meant to be messy. It's slow. It's meant to be slow, right? It's because it's supposed to be deliberative. That's not normally what people want, however, after they've had a revolution and they're trying to restructure a massive, right, a massive empire that's really, you know, antiquated in many respects, right? So on the one hand, it's like, you know, the analogy would be turning a huge ship, right? It's not going to help if you have everybody who's manning the ship debating as to whether they should go left or right. It's already hard enough to turn. And in particular, people thought that, you know, okay, we'll have this revolution, we'll have a constitutional government, and boom, we're going to be fine. We're going to be just like every other country. And that didn't happen, obviously. And it didn't also stop the military losses. Right? Part of this coup was an attempt to modernize and reform the military. And that was done, but they still lost when they were fighting, in particular in the Balkans, right, what today is Greece and neighboring regions. They lost against the Europeans. And this wounded pride, and it also angered the more nationalist faction of the Young Turk movement, which, as I said, was the Committee for Union and Progress, who, although they said that they believed in this constitutional government, really were aiming for having a more autocratic form of government in which the military and a form of nationalism would rule the day. And that nationalism was really known as Pan-Turkism, and that they wanted a Turkey for Turks, right? Armenians considered themselves Turks and that they were citizens of Turkey, but that's not what they meant. They meant they wanted a Turkey for ethnic Turks, how they defined it. And so they remained dissatisfied, and they themselves overthrow the government in 1913 and take power. They stage another coup, but this is a coup of the constitutional government, and they come to power and take control of the government, and it's led by a troika of pashas, a triumvirate of pashas. Pasha is a honorific title in Turkish, and it was Enver, the Minister of War, Talat Pasha, who was the Minister of the Interior, and the person who is basically the architect of the genocide. He basically put together the plans. He's the one who sent out the orders, and you know, he also had Armenian friends, and friends who came to him asking for help for their families, and they were really shocked when they found out he wasn't going to do it, because they said, we've known each other all of our lives. But he was, when he was asked, you know, why the women and the children, he said, well, what do you think those children are going to do when they grow up and they found out that we killed their fathers and brothers? So everyone had to be killed. Right? He was adamant about that. And also Cemal, the minister of the Navy. His role in the genocide is being questioned. Traditionally, he's linked with the other two in terms of perpetuating or perpetrating the genocide. But lately, some people have questioned, and there's some research that suggests that maybe he tried to delay it, or he tried to lessen its effects. I'm not quite sure where that's going to lead, but there has been a reevaluation also about by his, I believe it's his grandson, also who's who accepts that there was a genocide, but is trying to show that that Cemal Pasha was not as instrumental in it as we may have thought. Right after they come to power, one of the things that they want to do is enter the war. They know World War I is brewing. They feel like they can take advantage of a world war, or of a war, nobody knows there's going to be a world war at that time, in order to grab territories to the east. Their idea is to create a pan-Turkic empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The problem is there are a couple of people in between who may not feel so good about this idea, and so their hope was to push eastwards, eliminate the non-Turkic elements in between, and then reestablish what they considered this pan-Turkic empire that they posited to have existed over 1,000 years prior. And so they were aching to get into the war, although Germany was aching to keep them out of it. Germany, who had been allied with the Ottoman Empire, sent people there to train the military, sent them weapons, to upgrade their military, had a very close relationship with the Ottoman Empire. And part of the reason was that Germany did not benefit from the great colonialist movement that France and particularly England, Spain, and the Netherlands had. And they had felt sort of left out of not having any colonies the way these other powers did in Europe. They thought they were just as good and they should have power, they should have colonies. So instead, they decided to use their influence and extend it into the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire wasn't their colony, but they built the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad all the way to connect the two areas. As I said, they had lots of advisors go to the Ottoman Empire, and they found this was a way to extend German influence into another sphere. Even if they couldn't have a colony, they could at least have this on their side. So Enver is really desperate to enter in the war to get this started. Germany doesn't think that the Ottoman Empire is ready to fight on its own and didn't want to open up another front and tried to dissuade them, but they entered anyway. And in 1915, the end of 1914, Enver himself leads this massive drive eastwards. And at first it goes very well. They're making lots of progress eastwards as the Russian army is retreating, is moving backwards, and it's going very easily. but at the same time, their supply lines are becoming extended, the logistics aren't working. They're moving too fast, and their supplies can't keep up with them. And then winter hits, and they have a disastrous battle at Sarikamish where nearly, I forget how many people were killed, but it was a lot. Nearly his entire army, or a third of it, was killed. And he has this long retreat back into interior Ottoman space in the winter through a very harsh climate and a very harsh territory. All the animals were eventually killed, either to be eaten or because they froze to death. Most of the troops froze to death, and it was embarrassing for him when he had to come back to report in Constantinople about what happened, as it was a major loss. And what he does, even before he gets there, he starts sending cables ahead saying that the reason why they lost was because the Armenians helped the Russians. And so he blames them for this, what is really a logistical error on his part in having really thin supply lines and fighting in the winter. Nonetheless, very quickly, things are put into place. This is still a debated point. Let's just say it's unclear. Did the idea of exterminating the Armenian population start now? That is in January, February of 1915? Or was there already a plan formulated and the triumvirate was just waiting for an opportune moment to put it into place? It's hard to say. We don't, the evidence pointing definitively one way or another isn't there. One can say, however, is that Enver cables this back in January. Very quickly, the government is able to mobilize a campaign against the Armenians. Now, whether they were just very efficient at the time or whether they already had a plan somewhere in their pocket that they took out, I don't know. But in February 1915, the order came that Armenians were to be disarmed. This is an interesting thing. The Armenians were not originally part of the Ottoman Empire unless it was through force conscription, but as Christian subjects, they were not normally part of the army. However, after the coup, they were, and many of them signed up, and they did belong to the Ottoman the Ottoman army, and many of them went through, as we'll see, went through the imperial training academies, military academies, in order to serve. But in February 1915, the order came by that Armenians were going to be disarmed. And this was also very important because one of the great excuses that the Ottomans would use would be the suspicion of having firearms. That is, for people who live in the country and who live off of hunting, right? Normally, you have some sort of firearm in order to survive, right? You're not going to go hunting, chasing down a deer or whatever animal with an axe, right? Or a knife. And they use this idea of looking to confiscate weapons as a reason for arresting people and sending them to prison or to sending them on death marches. So this became an important aspect of their program. It also meant that the Armenians who were in the army were told to give up their weapons, which sort of stinks if you're in the middle of a war and you're told to give up your weapon. They were then moved, most of them, to work details. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but either as digging ditches, laying down rail line, clearing debris, carting supplies, but they were taken out of the infantry units and demilitarized in that way and put into working units. Then on April 8th, the inhabitants of the town of Zeytun, which had been somewhat problematic, it's a mountainous area, Zeytun, in eastern Turkey. Very hard. It's always been hard for the Ottoman government to exert any control there whatsoever. In fact, for the longest time, their tax, I'd love to have this tax, was to send oil, olive oil, to Constantinople for lamps. And that was it. Because the Ottomans realized there was no way to really get them to pay up in any sort of reasonable way. Because it's very hilly, very mountainous. They knew the terrain. But nonetheless, on April 8th, they were able to deport the inhabitants of Zaytun because they knew that this would be one of the areas of resistance later on. So they got them out of the way quickly. Likewise, Van, as I said, which had the majority Armenian population, the Ottoman Empire started moving in there quickly as well. And on April 19th, there were massacres in Van. Now, the Vanatsis did actually manage to stage a defense and barricade themselves, and they withstood a siege until the Russians came. But then the Russians had to withdraw, and most of the Vanatsis went with them. And a lot of them died on that march, trying to get out of the Ottoman Empire once the Russian Empire was starting to withdraw, because they themselves are having their own problems with the revolution, and they didn't feel like that they could hold the line. And then on April 24th, as I said, approximately 250 Armenian leaders in Constantinople were arrested and then murdered. And then, as I mentioned, by 1916, over 1 million people had been murdered and 500,000 displaced. Okay, so that's a very quick, I would say, unfolding of events. So that even if, because people often ask, well, why didn't somebody do something to try and stop it? You can see this is really between April and December of 1915, in the middle of a war. It's not very easy to stop this at all, because it was happening at such a speed. As I said, by 1923, 1.5 million were dead. Okay, so this fits the paradigm of genocide. Okay, we got that off? Okay. I want to see how this fits into the actual paradigm of genocide. First of all, even before the genocide was started, Armenians were denigrated, depicted as disease, as vermin. They were polluting the Turkish nation. They were scabs, right? They were parasites. They were interested only in money and themselves. They had a separate identity, did not like to assimilate. And for all of these reasons, and also because they were Christian, they were all traitors. They were aligned with the European allies behind, the Turks' back. This is sort of what's being put out there, say by, pretty consistently from the 1890s onwards. That doesn't mean everybody believed it, but this becomes part of the narrative within the Ottoman Empire. We can also notice the pattern of extermination. This was not, sometimes people say, oh, it's just random killings. These were not random, right? The men were first gathered and then held and then marched out of town, where they were then either shot or bayoneted. All right? Mostly that would happen. They would be taken out of town, they were told. Sometimes they were taken to the next town, and they were allowed to write messages back, or encouraged to write messages back saying that they made it okay, so that everybody back home thought they were fine. Then they were taken out and shot, or to save bullets, bayoneted. Sometimes they would just have the train stop in the middle of the desert, let everybody off, and just kill them right there. The elderly and women and children were then later told that they were going to have to be evacuated and moved. They would, there was a whole process to this. Again, it wasn't as though you just have random people coming into the village and killing them. Right? And not that this makes it any better, but the authorities would come in. One of the things that they would make you do is make a list of all of your property and possessions so that you could get them back when you returned. Right? So everybody wrote everything down that they had. Right? They then passed a law saying any property not claimed by this such and such a date would be confiscated by the state, or would fall underneath, well, it didn't say confiscated by the state, it would fall to a division of property within the state, and then eventually it was confiscated by the state. And of course, the authorities knew nobody was coming back. Right? So they make people come up with these lists. They made a copy that was kept in the hometown. Another copy was sent to Istanbul. Right? So there were usually 2 copies. Right? And everybody said, don't worry. When you come back, we'll have this all back to you. And then, of course, everybody was taken out and then killed. And nobody came back to claim the property. And so legal action was taken in order for the state to claim all of this property, which it then was able to redistribute as it saw fit. So this is not random killing. This is not, we would say, just angry locals who came in, who had a fight with their neighbors and wound up killing an entire village. No, this was an actually legally, and I say this with, quotes, a legally sort of ordered and executed murder and robbery of a population. The women and children were not necessarily killed outright by bullets. What normally happened is that they were marched. You can see these are the major areas in which the populations were deported, and then they were marched into the desert and brought to sometimes in circles, often in circles. And we know this because we have the letters of some of the people who were ordered to take them around, complaining, saying, we're marching around the desert in circles with old women and children, and I have no idea why. Right? I said I signed up into the Ottoman Empire to fight our enemies, not to march women and children in a circle in the desert. Right? Along the way, often the caravans of these people put on these marches were raided by local tribesmen. Sometimes local Turkish officials would come and they would pick out whom they considered the prettiest girls and take them away. Often, rape was a common phenomenon that happened. Likewise, the selling into slavery of these women. Some people came and they picked one out and married them, and those people became Kurdish or Arab or Turkish, and became part of a new family. Out of that, many women committed suicide. Many of them killed their babies because they couldn't survive. There was limited resources. That's one of the hardest things they had to do. But there were reports also of lots of people throwing themselves off of cliffs into the river Euphrates, so that it ran red. And in some places, because of the bodies, it diverted its course. That it flowed in a different direction. Now, after they'd been marched, if they survived all of these marches, they were put into concentration camps, particularly at a place called Deir Zor. People may have heard of Deir Zor. It was the capital, or at least one of the major centers of ISIS most recently, where they actually, I believe, destroyed the Armenian Genocide monument because it was a Christian site that was there. But there was an Armenian church. In Syria, they did erect a chapel to it, but tens of thousands of people died there. Hundreds of thousands of people died there. The conditions were terrible. People were cramped in the middle. Nowadays, there's a town. In those days, there was nothing. It was just the middle of the desert. And they were led to that spot along other concentration camps, one after another. And recent research by a scholar named Khachik Muradian has also traced life in these camps, as much as we can tell. And it was also not a very pretty picture, obviously, in that. And many Armenians, the guards would choose Armenians to be the heads of the camps over the other Armenians, and be the one who had to make decisions as to who got water, who got food, who got the good spots to stay, who didn't. And they would do that, and then they would take them to the next camp, and they would take the ones who were treated the worst and make them the new rulers of the camp to take revenge on the ones who had been the rulers in the other camp. And so they tried to set the Armenians against each other within the camps themselves as well. So as I said, none of this was happenstance. All of this seems to have been well organized and planned. And the other aspect of it, as I mentioned, is the simultaneity. Right? This happened all at the same time, pretty much. Between April and August 1915, the Armenians of nearly every major town and village were deported. Right? Again, it is not something that happened, as you'll often hear denialists claim. It was the fog of war. Things happened. Right? It was an accident. It wasn't planned. The speed and the organization with which it happened are actually quite remarkable. In terms of how they were able to murder 800,000 people in 4 months. Okay. The other aspect of it is, which I like to bring up in terms of it being the first modern genocide, is the use of technology and the organization that I've been pointing out. First of all, the telegraph, which was relatively new in terms of technology, was used to communicate orders. So we can see that we have the telegraphs from Istanbul to the provinces ordering in places the deportation of the inhabitants, right? And the new railway lines that I mentioned that the Germans helped build transported Armenians in these packed cars. As I said, they would often stop in the middle of the desert, take everybody out, kill them, and then the train would go back. To add insult to injury, they made you buy the ticket to get on that train, right? And many people died on the train ride because they were packed all the way to capacity. There was very little room to breathe. It was hot inside the cars, and then they never reached their destination. Again, this is something that will become familiar later on also in the Holocaust, as trains took people to the concentration camps. And a special organization, the Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, was established. Special organization was charged, basically, with the extermination of the Armenian population. And that was their one of their main targets. Again, we see this in other genocides of the 20th century, where a special branch of the government is tasked with doing this activity. And here it was filled a lot with ex-cons and murderers. They tended to use, unremarkably in that sense, or unsurprisingly, the government did release a lot of psychopaths and murderers from prison and used them to orchestrate the killings. But that's, and as I mentioned, the Armenians were gathered in concentration camps. But this organization, this use of technology and the formation of special organization shows also that almost every branch of the government, again, also with the confiscation of lands and the laws that were passed in order to legalize this whole activity, show that almost every branch of the government was involved in some way with this activity. Right? This was not, again, I just want to reiterate, not the breakdown of relations between local actors that erupted violently. All right? This was something that was coordinated from the top. And it wasn't just Armenians, and it's something that I do have to say. Assyrian Christians, I mentioned them before, that a lot of them lived in the same area, particularly the southern part where Armenians lived, intermarried with them, definitely lived together with them. I know a number of Assyrians who have very good Armenian last names, but they're just Assyrian, whose families, some of them didn't speak any dialect of Aramaic before they spoke Turkish at home and Armenian. Right? But nonetheless, they realized that they were Assyrian Christian, and they had a distinct identity, and they spread basically over that southern area where you saw into northern Mesopotamia and into Iran, and they also commemorate 1915 as the year of the sword, the Saifo in Aramaic. So about 200 to 250,000 were killed in southeastern Turkey and Urmia region of Iran between 1915 and 1923, and possibly as high as 400,000. There aren't exact numbers on this, but between 200 and 400,000 people had been killed, about over half the population. There are now a large population in Turlock of Assyrians here in California, in the Central Valley, but in Turlock in particular. Likewise, the Greek community suffered incredibly, and this is it's a slightly different conflict, and it continued afterwards in population transfers between the Balkans and Greece and Turkey, as Greek Christians moved from Turkey to Greece, and Muslims moved from Greece to Turkey. But again, the numbers range from 450 to 900,000. This is more in the northern part of Anatolia. And then in Smyrna in 1922, up to 100,000 people. There was a great fire in the old part of the town that was inhabited mainly by Greeks and Armenians, and the Turkish troops basically pushed everybody to the sea and pushed them in. And about maybe 100,000 people were killed in that, and the city was burned. And it was probably the Ottoman army that actually started the fire itself. So this was also a major disaster at the time and well known. You can see that in this, I found this picture of the three nations, these are the flags of the three nations together, and this is from and sort of united in this tragedy of what happens in 1915 with Armenia in the center. Here's the Armenian flag in the center, the Greek flag here, and then to the left here the Assyrian flag. And I should say that both the Assyrian genocide and the Greek genocide were recognized by the International Association of Genocide Scholars in 2007 and by the Republic of Armenia in 1915. And there's more work, I would say there's more work done on the Armenian genocide in particular than on the other two. But more work, and particularly the Assyrian one, but more people are paying attention to the Assyrian genocide now as well. And hopefully scholars will be able to collaborate in sort of unpacking what happened in the Ottoman Empire to all three of these communities at this time. But the Armenian population, though, did receive the brunt of the 1915 to the 1922 policy of extermination. It's clear that the triumvirate was particularly obsessed with eliminating the Armenian population. And this is a map that I think just really explains, or at least makes it visual, the impact of the genocide on this region. Right? So these are your 6 Armenian provinces, and you can see there are Armenians who live in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, obviously. In 1914, before the genocide, the darker it is, the larger the population. But that's 1914, and there's 1926. Right? So you can see that entire population has been pretty much eliminated. If we were talking about, numbers are hard because we don't have accurate figures for what the population was in a lot of places. But people have speculated that there may have been around 2 to 3 million Armenians in that area. 2 million of which 1.5 were killed, 500,000 were deported or went on the marches. So you can see, and the remainder, a lot of them were Turkified or Kurdicized. We don't know. This is an interesting development. As I said, nowadays this area is mainly Kurdish, and in most of these places it has a large Kurdish population. And a lot of people today are coming forward in these areas saying, oh, my grandmother was Armenian. My mother was Armenian. I'm part Armenian. And this was unheard of 40 years ago, completely unheard of. But people are discovering their Armenian roots. And there's been quite a movement, I would say, in these Kurdish regions. And there's a reason for, there's also a political reason for this. Once the Turkish government was finished with the Armenians, then now they had a Kurdish problem. And so the Kurds, who also, many of whom want to be independent, were then subject to discrimination and violence by the Republic of Turkey. And so there is a political aspect that once, a lot of the killing in the genocide was done by Kurds, but now they're also probably one of the most vocal part of the population that accepts that there was a genocide, even though I went to a town called Palu that had been Armenian and is now Kurdish. And when we got there, I went with a group of Armenians. The chief came out and greeted us and said, our grandparents killed your grandparents. We were promised that there was gold here. Where is it? And the people who were on the tour were flabbergasted. But this is the first time anybody had ever told them that this had happened. Right? Normally they would say, no, never. Armenians never lived here, never happened. And here you have the people saying, no, our grandparents killed them because we were told there was gold and we could have it. And they said, we dug up everything in the village, and the only thing we could find were the gold fillings in the cemetery from the corpses, from the skeletons. And they had to tell them, listen, and it's true, even now, if you're Armenian and you go back to parts of eastern Anatolia and Kurds find out you're Armenian, they will follow you. Because a lot of them think that you're coming back to get the gold that your family left hidden there. And I have a friend who actually, sort of cruel, made a fake map and pretended that he was following it and then had all these people come up behind him. But it's a very, very strange dynamic, because on the one hand, here you have people who like clearly admit that this happened, right? And yet it was their ancestors who did it at the same time. And it's an emotion, and they're very friendly, they're very nice, they're polite, they serve you food, they give you tea, and they're very kind, they have no hatred now. Obviously, they just want to know where the money is. And when you tell them it's not here, they just go, oh, that was a shame. Right? And it's a very, very strange experience to have. But you can see what this did very clearly between that to this, in a matter in less than a decade, and the cultural and demographic impact that the genocide had. Okay. The other thing that I like to say, people knew. Another thing that you often hear, it's like, well, it was so far away, what could anybody do? Nobody knew about it, right? Today, we hardly know what's going on over there. Can you imagine in 1915, what would Americans have known? What would the world have known? And actually, it was one of the most well-known events, of the world at the time. Right? In fact, people knew more about it then than they do today, unfortunately. Right? And in the New York Times, nearly 200 articles between 1915 and 1922 appeared about what happened to the Armenians. And again, what I was saying before, million Armenians killed or in exile, policy of extermination. Right? The word genocide hadn't been invented, but you can see how they're trying to do it. More atrocities. Right? And we also, America played an important role in documenting this because America was neutral in World War I up until fairly late in the war, which meant that we had consular staff there, our embassy was still there, and our ambassador was Henry Morgenthau, who wrote about this and challenged Talat Pasha on the policy. And he sent back reports to the United States outlining detailing what was happening, what he was getting from his consuls throughout the empire, and them writing to him saying, we just saw another village eliminated, we just saw another group of people killed, we just passed a train of, a caravan of women walking through the desert with their children, and they won't let us get near them, they won't let us help them at all. And there were American missionaries, as they could also stay there. We'll talk about them in a second. But they stayed there. They took in a lot of the orphans and tried to help them. This is somewhat controversial because oftentimes they converted them, right? That they made them Protestant. These are mainly Protestant missionaries. They made them Protestant and they abandoned their Armenian apostolicity. Some of them returned to being Armenian apostolic when they got to, when they finally grew up and they were wherever they were, America, usually in America, but others not. That they remained Protestant. And I have to say, a number of Armenians had converted to Protestantism before the genocide as well. American missionaries had been in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, set up schools to educate, particularly women, and that was really useful. As I said, my wife's family went to Roberts College, which is now Boğaziçi in Istanbul, and that helped them immensely when they were forced to leave and come to the United States. They already spoke multiple languages, they were educated, they were able to adapt to their new life much more easily because of that. So the American missionaries did do a lot of good in the Ottoman Empire, as did other, there were French schools as well, Roman Catholic schools as well, but it was the American schools that wound up, once World War I began, being the one who had orphanages and bringing them in. But it wasn't just them, and we'll talk about that in a second. People actually helped. Right? As I said, these missionaries did help, but people also in the United States helped. Right? The American Committee for Relief in the Near East was founded, which is now the Near East Relief Fund, was founded in order to raise money to help the orphans. And between 1916 and 1930, the U.S. raised $116 million in relief money, the equivalent of $1.5 billion, the largest relief effort ever to this day. All right? How many people learned about this in school? Maybe 1, 2. This is a great moment in American history. Right? It's not taught about at all, despite the fact that in California, you're supposed to, God bless you, you're supposed to, it's mandated that the Armenian Genocide be taught. But there's another aspect to it, too. right? This is something that, as Americans we should know as well. The fact that our country was willing to do this, right? And it was the first time, now we're used to it, all right? A disaster happens in a place, we get people coming on television asking for money, they solicit donations, you have politicians going out asking for money, trying to raise money to help. Celebrities, this is the first time that it ever happened. It involved presidents, politicians, celebrities. You can maybe read this. Babe Ruth presented one of his home run bats to Mademoiselle Nuvart Zeran Koshkarian, who will sell it to the highest bidder for the Near East Relief Fund to help orphans. Okay, so I mean, it went to that level. It's everything that we would recognize in a modern relief effort. And this is really the first time we see this sort of activity happening. So people really did come together. It was very well known at the time. An expression that Armenians don't like today, but that was was used a lot, was called starving Armenians, to refer to people who are downtrodden or who have had a hard time with things. They would refer to them as starving Armenians. Likewise, then, people often then afterwards, in the wake of World War II, would use the expression, who remembers the Armenians? This was said by Adolf Hitler when he was embarking on the policy of the Holocaust, of the final solution, when people said, well, won't people care that we're eliminating an entire population? And he said in return, basically, who today remembers the Armenians? Between 1930 and 1939, a policy, and it really was a policy. Some of it was accidental and sort of like time moving on, but there was also a deliberate policy of trying to forget what happened, especially at the official level. Right? As the Republic of Turkey becomes more and more important player in international politics, as they start showing signs of westernizing, of being an ally to the West, and then especially in the 50s after they become a NATO member, and they're clearly anti-Soviet. There's also an official policy of trying not to bring this up in the United States as well, which is part of that legacy is why you don't hear about this. It's because for several generations we were told it didn't happen, right? Just you don't have to think about it. Okay, let's turn to actual rescuers themselves. I've already mentioned some missionaries. I'm going to mention a couple of others. We have Danish missionaries. These two women in particular were absolutely really fantastic. We have Maria Jakobsen and Karen Jeppe, both Danish, right? And I'll talk about Maria, who's known as Mama to many Armenians, in a bit. But young women, they were in their 20s when they went out there, and they spent several years there. Maria, in particular, learned Armenian at night, and then spent basically the rest of her life dedicated to the Armenians. I'll talk about her in a second. And these are this is a commemorative stamps issued by the Republic of Armenia. We can also mention the German medic and photographer Armin Wegener. Now, he did help some of the orphans on the way from medical, even though he was on the Turkish side technically, right? He was a German who was being sent there to advise the Ottoman army and to serve in the Ottoman army. But he saw what was happening, and he was absolutely flabbergasted. And in fact, Germany didn't publicize this. Did not publicize. Germany knew what was going on. They decided not to make a big deal of it. They wanted to keep it under wraps. The reason being, and that's why Wegener is so important, because he took these photographs and he's sending them back saying, look what's going on. And they wanted to keep it under wraps because they said the German population would be absolutely annoyed beyond all recognition if they found out a population was being eliminated. Right? If this sort of extermination were taking place, Germany would demand, the German population would demand that our alliance with the Ottoman Empire be broken, that Germany's alliance with the Ottoman Empire be broken, because they would find this so outrageous. And yet, just a few decades later, they themselves would be doing the exact same thing. But here we have, this is a famous picture that he took of a woman carrying her child across the desert. For those of you who may have seen the Yazidi woman who had to flee from ISIS recently, it basically, after 100 years, it's the same exact picture. But he is very important for the documentation. He also, as a medic, saved many orphans as well. And then somebody else I like to mention is Stanley Kerr. I mention him because his grandson is Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors. His grandfather actually was a biochemist, and he wound up working, and a missionary, wound up working for Near East Relief. And he went and saved a number of children, and also healed a number of orphans, and spent a long time there, and then in Lebanon, where he also was active in Armenian affairs there. And that's him there on the right with these are all members of the Near East Relief Society. And you could say a lot of these people in the Near East Society were sort of young idealists, where they really thought they were going out to as a force for good, and really devoted themselves wholeheartedly to saving these people. Sometimes what they did is, as I said, considered controversial today, but there's no doubt that they were really putting themselves on the line and leaving far more comfortable lives to try and help people that were, far away, and with whom they had no contact previously. Right? They had no ethnic identity. There wasn't giant communities in the United States where they had friends, and so this was really, going out there and just trying to do good in the world. Maria Jakobsen is particularly, I think, inspirational in that way. She arrived in Harpe, imagine at 24. I mean, some of you are maybe 24 getting there. Imagine now just getting up and going to some country where you don't know the language that is, even when she got there, it wasn't yet World War I, but nonetheless, we know that there are problems because there have been massacres. It would just be like getting up today and not knowing anything and just heading off to Syria because they need nurses. And that's basically what she did. And she worked in the American hospital there until the Americans had to withdraw because of our own entrance in into the war. And then she herself stayed on and continued to do the work that the American hospital was doing before they had to leave. She herself adopted 3 children, and it's been estimated that she saved approximately 3,600 children through her activities during the war. Afterwards, all right, so the war is over. She actually, through her activities, she caught typhus from some of the people that she saved, and had to return. She went to Denmark to heal, and she went to the United States also to go on a lecture tour and to raise money to go back. And she went back to Lebanon, and she founded an orphanage there. And that orphanage later in 1928, became known as the Bird's Nest, where she continued to raise Armenian children who had been orphaned by the genocide. And that's a picture of her here later with all of these kids. And about 200 students at one time, each time would go through there. And so it's a very important place. It still exists. And it's in a very important, I would say, landmark for Armenians of Lebanon still. If you ask them about it, they had a reunion, I think, once of some people who had gone through there. And as I said, that's how she got the name Mayrik, or Mama, that she's often referred to. And even on the stamp, it says that in Armenian. And not only that, she also wrote a diary of what happened. And this is also another important source for what happened during the genocide. She did write down as things went through. And this has recently been published, translated into English, and published. I don't know if you can see it. There is a Diaries of a Danish Missionary. So she was a very important source. So this is one group of rescuers that we can talk about. And mainly and largely, there were not only Protestant missionaries, but a large group of them were Protestant missionaries. Another, and I would say more controversial one, that's why there's a question there, are Turks and Kurds who rescued or helped save Armenians. This is more controversial for a couple of reasons, because as I said, since officially, according to the Turkish government, the genocide never happened, how can you be a rescuer? On the other hand, it's also been very difficult for Armenians to say that there were good Turks and Kurds who did this. There's also been the confusion between what does it mean to save them? If you took them out of a line because you found them attractive and then raised them, as sort of as a slave or even as your wife or as your child, but then converted them to Islam and then and basically had them lose their Armenian identity, is that rescuing them or not? Some people have had a hard time squaring that circle. Is that rescuing, or is that some sort of taking advantage of a population that you can now use? So there are, I would say, tensions revolving around that issue. However, if you do look through Armenian survivor stories, in many, many, many of them, there's always a Turk or a Kurd, a neighbor, who alerted them, who hid them, who gave them food in order to escape when they escaped, told them to get out and not come back, all right, and told them that this is not just for your safety, that they're planning to kill you. And they took significant risk doing this. It was a crime to hide Armenians, and you could be killed for it. So a lot of them did put themselves at significant risk, but because of the denial, this has not been an aspect that's been able to come out as well. But I'll talk about that in a second. But we can see that there are various types, I would say, of helping in terms of going from elites ignoring or minimizing orders, that is governors getting the order or local officials getting the order to do this to the Armenians and they're not wanting to do it, saying like this isn't right for various reasons. Some of them thought it went against their own faith. Some of them said, I can't do it because I've known these people my entire life. How am I going to get rid of them now? They're friends, right? And they either tried to not follow the order by ignoring it. Often those people were reassigned somewhere else, right? Or they made it look like they were following the order and basically trying to help people get out as fast as they can, right? Not obviously not a lot of people did this, but it did happen. And then we have alerting Armenians, as I mentioned, hiding them, providing food on marches, and then some people did adopt some Armenians in good faith, all right? And you could have, and we do have examples of, one of the things that Stanley Kerr was involved in was actually finding Armenian orphans. And that meant going to Kurdish and Turkish families and finding Armenian orphans and taking them away from these families to try and reunite them with their families who may or may not be alive. This is also a controversial procedure. And it caused some trauma too, because oftentimes there were some Kurdish families that raised these people that they adopted, that they took in as their own daughter. It was usually women, but sometimes as their own daughter or as their own son. And then having done that for 5 years, somebody comes by and says, no, we're taking it to the United States. And that's it. And some of them fought it, both legally and actually physically, just said, you're not doing that. She's our daughter. So this did lead to some tension. So there were some, I would say, legitimate adoptions in that sense. People who really loved these children and took care of them and treated them like their own. But likewise, there was this notion on the other side that they should try to be reunited with whatever family members that could be found. So that was also another type of rescue in that sense. So there is now a movement to recognizing, and I put the righteous Turks, this is based on the sort of Yad Vashem Holocaust experience of finding righteous Gentiles who tried to help during the Holocaust. There is somewhat of a desire to recognize these righteous Turks, many of whom are unknown and forgotten because of the denialists. But as I said, it's problematic. So here is one headed up by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, Turkish rescuers. So it's a report on Turks who reached out to Armenians in 1915. We have the Turk Who Saved Me project that was sort of sponsored by the European Integration non-governmental organization in conjunction with Armenia, which is an analyst firm, and as well as the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They have this project that comes about stories of Turks who saved Armenians by the survivors. And more articles are coming out that are talking about, okay, let's see, how do we do this? I think part of it is trying to find a paradigm and looking to the Jewish experience to see who really counts as a rescuer, who doesn't. It's somewhat how do we acknowledge this? How do we handle it? So there are more and more articles about the whole problem, as well as bringing to light that this happened, and that we need to recognize who these Turks and Kurds were. However, as I said, there's still problems. One of the big ones is that, we can't ask either one of those populations, right? The victims, the survivors are all dead now, as well as the people who rescued them. So it's not as though we can ask somebody. They do, and you can go, also very popular today in Turkey, or to find, lots of families who say, yes, my grandfather or my grandmother rescued. Then is this, like, when you go to a village and everybody says that their grandparents did that, well, then how come, where is everybody? There are other problems in identifying them. We also have motivations that skew the results. That is, there are certain people, and I say motivations, they're good motivations. A lot of people think that this is possibly one way to bring about reconciliation between Turks and Armenians. And that if we could focus on those Turks and Kurds who rescued Armenians, then that's a starting point from which Armenians and Turks can come together and sort of have a dialogue, a conversation, and possibly reach some common ground. And as I said, it's from the best of motivations often. Sometimes, however, that can also be reinterpreted so that the people who've done this become highlighted, and this becomes a showcase of how good Turks and Kurds were towards Armenians, and yet we share a common trauma of what happened in World War I. So there are some other motivations that put it in a very different light. And either way, it's probably best to not treat this with any motivations, but try to treat it from a scholarly perspective. Likewise, the legacy of silence, as I said, between the 1930s and 1965, nothing was really talked about having to do with the Armenian Genocide. Whether in terms of books, whether in terms of movies, whether in terms of any sort of no commemorations, no speeches, anything that was done, even amongst Armenians, was done internal, within the community, usually in Armenian, so that the younger generations wouldn't understand or have a difficult time understanding it. They didn't talk about it. They said, look, we survived. I don't want to relive that. I have a new life to make here in America. I don't want to bring that back up. But we also then, some collections of stories were made immediately afterwards, and those are priceless. I'll get to those in a second. But a lot of time passed before people really started to talk about this in the open. And 1965 was it was a watershed year, the 50th anniversary, when in the Soviet Union, the Armenians in the Soviet Republic of Armenia risked actual punishment from the state to protest and to have commemorative marches. And they were surrounded by tanks and attack helicopters, because technically in the Soviet Union you were not allowed to have any of these mass congregations like that. And American Armenians saw that too and said, well, if they're doing it, why aren't we doing anything? And the Montebello monument was erected at that time, and that started opening up the dialogue. And as I said, another problem is the continued Turkish denial. It's hard to have a dialogue with someone if they say it didn't happen. And you can try to focus in on the rescuers, the Turks and Kurds who may have rescued Armenians, but if there's been no official admission of this within the Republic of Turkey, it's hard to find actual people who could say that they did this, because their descendants may not even be aware of it, because it's been denied there for so long. So those are some of the problems. I also have a different sort of problem. A lot of the emphasis when we talk about rescuers, and maybe some of the other talks will come out with this, a lot of the emphasis often focuses on other people who did things, as though the population that suffered then has to live in some sort of eternal gratitude to other people who helped them, or that they themselves were completely helpless and were dependent upon these other people to come in and save them. And this is not to downplay what any of these people did. They took personal decisions that were beyond courageous and risked their lives to help. But I think what often gets lost in that paradigm is that the victims, quote unquote, themselves were living human beings who did not just go off and get killed. They also tried to help. In some places, they were able to fight back successfully, even if for a time. But we have to look at what I would call rescuer survivors. Just by surviving, you undoubtedly rescued someone else, because nobody survived alone. Right? They all went off and did, right, usually in families, groups of children, right? They all rescued each other. And so every survivor in some way is also a rescuer. And I think that's important to note. But you have places like Musadag, right? Musadag is a famous one where Armenians who were cornered by the Ottoman Empire on this hilly, this mountain, it means actually Mount Moses in Turkish, overlooking the Mediterranean. They were surrounded, and they managed to put up a defense, a military defense, an armed defense of to save their lives, long enough for the French Navy to save them, right? And they were able to get out. And one village actually managed to stay there and survive up until today. There's one Armenian village left there. So that was their own use of their own power and organizational skills to defend against a much larger enemy and get out. And I mentioned this was actually one of the more popular accounts in the early 30s of the Armenian Genocide. It was written by Franz Werfel, The 40 Days of Musadag, and it was slated in the 30s to become a major motion picture through MGM. It had been translated into English, to all these other languages. It was a bestseller. Everybody read it, and they were like, perfect, it's going to make a great movie. And then the State Department called up and said, you're not going to make that movie. And MGM said, why? And said, because the Republic of Turkey does not want you to make that movie. And so it's from that moment on, when I talked about that policy of silence, that we see it start to spread, where it even affects, right, what can be in the popular culture. Right? It's not just the U.S. government not saying that it happened. It's actually telling people in this country what they can and cannot do because of what may or may not please the Republic of Turkey. But that was one of the early ones. We also have what was called humanitarian resistance. And I didn't coin the term again. It was Khachik Mouradian who's been focusing on this humanitarian resistance. The idea that, okay, even if we can't fight back, right, we can at least have ways of feeding people, hiding people along the way, right, helping people get out. And one of the centers for this in particular was in Aleppo. And Father Harachun Yesayan, who headed up, and this is him in the center here, and this is the Council for Armenian Refugees. And they would, and this is well known, they would try, as people were coming on the marches, before they got to Deir Zor, Aleppo was one of the places that they would go through, and that was one of the first stops before they then went out again into the desert. I mean, it was usually a long walk from wherever you were in Eastern Turkey to Aleppo, and then from Aleppo they then started moving them through the camps to Deir Zor eventually. So in Aleppo, Father Yesayan and his group tried to do as much as they could to help all those people who were going through, because they arrived in Aleppo starving, half naked, if not completely naked, dehydrated, sick, right, with various diseases. And so they set up ways of raising money and of feeding these people, of clothing these people, and sometimes even being able to get them out from Aleppo to other places so that they could survive. So we always have to remember that the victim population also, can fall under the role of not just survivor, but also of rescuer. And I think in learning these stories, we have a few sort of places we can turn to find out more, to start to look at it in these different lights. One of them are the oral accounts that have been gathered together, particularly in North America. And there was a conference at UCLA recently on the oral history collections in North America. And these have been, some of them, this is a particularly interesting one. There's a collection, unfortunately it's in Armenian, hopefully someone's going to translate. Part of them have been translated into English, but there's been a movement in Armenia to collect the testimonies of survivors. A lot of these testimonies were actually written in the 20s too. They're not just based on interviews now. They were based on what people had said immediately afterwards, which is an interesting thing too. And so both in the immediate aftermath and later. So those are being published in Yerevan. And then we have the oral history projects at UCLA, USC, Columbia University, University of Michigan, where people for decades had been recording, starting in the 70s, I believe, their experiences in the genocide. Now that that generation is pretty much all gone, these are invaluable. I mean, there's no way to put a price on these collections, and the more that we can get people working on them, the better in terms of making this and sort of getting a better picture of exactly what it was like and what people went through to survive. And then finally, I would like to say survivor memoirs. These have been ignored. I mean, they've come out. People have put them out. And again, they started, there's some that were written in the 20s, some that are more recent, have been published more recently. But for a long time, these were ignored, not just by non-Armenians, but also by Armenians. And the reason for this is, in my opinion, partially is that the emphasis has been on proving the genocide, right? And in like a law case, you got to prove that it happened. Well, you can't take Armenian accounts because, of course, they're going to say there was a genocide, right? So therefore, we don't need these because they don't provide any objective evidence, right? And I said this is like a form of censorship. Even though some people did publish them, some people did put them out there, but they weren't very much used. It's also a genre that's very difficult for the scholar to use because it is a personal reflection. We have problems of sort of what happens with memory over time, what happens with the narrative, right? How do you use a memoir as a historical source? Those are methodological problems, but I think we've come to the point now where we can actually use them in a productive fashion because we're not looking for objective in terms of, this is the smoking gun. I mean, there was a genocide. We know there was a genocide. We don't need to prove it with these documents. What we need to do with these documents is see what happened to the victims, see how all of this unfolded, see how they remember it, right? How they survived, what they did. And they're very interesting things that can be learned from them. I've mentioned one here. This is the one of Yervant Alexanian, who was born at the time of the Hamidian massacres in 1895, survived the genocide, and eventually then came to America and became very successful in New York. And his daughter just published his memoir. And I'm familiar with it, and she asked me to write the introduction. One of the interesting parts of this thing, well, let me just talk about him. It's a unique perspective because this is how he survived, was actually in the Ottoman army. This is not a very common story, although we do know, as I said, Armenians did serve in the army, in the imperial army, right? Then they were disarmed, but they served in work details. And basically, whatever work detail they needed, he basically said, I can do it. Even though he didn't, so he had to be a tailor. He didn't know anything about sewing, right? He did very basic work. And in fact, there were other people there who taught him really how to do a better job so that he would survive. But the one thing, I mean, the really odd thing, I mean, 51 members of his family, including his mother, were killed during the genocide. But he survived because he could play the bugle. He was in a unit, right? In fact, they wound up killing all of his friends who were like the tailors, all the people who were in the work details. But they needed someone to play the bugle whenever an officer came, all right? Or whenever they were going to have, in the morning, they have to do revelry or whatever. They needed someone to play the bugle. So he said, I can play the bugle. And he didn't really know how to play the bugle, but he was better than anybody else in the unit. And so they kept him as the bugle player through the war. And then afterwards, he got to Istanbul. He was on leave, and he was able eventually to get out. Now, I mean, it's a strange story. I mean, it's unique. I mean, not many people could do it. But one of the things that I found incredibly important about this memoir is that it not only, I mean, it's important as somebody who survived about life in the army, what happened to people in those work details. He goes into how they were taken out and executed. But he also gives us a snapshot of life. He was from the town of Sivas in Sebastia, the region of Sebastia. What life was like there before, in his childhood recollections, and really shows, even though, obviously this was written afterwards, he uses the term genocide. He has a a very stark dichotomy. There are bloodthirsty Turks and they were innocent Armenians. And that goes through the text. You see that. But yet he describes a life in 19th century Sivas, in the late 19th, early 20th century, where it's very clear that there are lots of interconnections between these communities. He taught French to an army officer, a Turkish army officer, whose daughter was clearly, teasing Yervant when he was younger. He is partially saved at an earlier period by a Turkish client who came into the store that he worked in and alerted them to get out. Right? He isn't saved by that officer whom he taught French. And you can tell that betrayal was the most painful for him. Because he felt, and I think this is where you start to see the unraveling of that society. It was a traditional society, and there are certain social expectations based upon a sort of friendship. Right? And he had total expectation when he appealed to that officer whom he taught French for so many years, whom was like, he was welcomed to the house like a member of the family. When he asked for this help, he fully expected to get it. And the guy basically said, there's nothing I can do. Right? It's above me. It's not above my pay grade. And it's that sort of betrayal that stings him. And where you start to see how what had been yes, tensions between the communities, but nonetheless, integrated community starts to fall apart. You also have the friend who does help him. But you can't escape what has been the failure of these social networks that had been built up over generations in some cases. And then when those fail, it's that pain that really affects him. That's the one thing he can't forgive. Right? And that in some ways that becomes one of the more poignant parts of the text. And I'm not even sure he's aware of it when he writes about it. Because he mentions it, and yet you can still tell that decades later he feels let down by that guy in a way that he doesn't necessarily feel by other people. And so these memoirs are important not only because of the details that they give us, but about the genocide itself, but also about these sort of dynamics between people. And that, I think, is the key to then understanding how we move from these societies. Is one of the biggest question that faces us. How does this happen? I think this is still one of the questions we have no great answer to. How do you go from societies in which, whether it's Germany, and yes, you can talk about anti-Semitism in Germany for a long time, but Jews nonetheless felt integrated into that society to a large extent. Armenians felt integrated into this society to a large extent. Right? And that's not just because they're lying to themselves. There is a degree to which they're absolutely essential to both of these societies. And yet, within a very short period of time, that integration turns into a policy of extinction. And I think some of these memoirs lead to show how these small steps in the breakdown of these relationships sort of leads to this disastrous results. I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have. I thank you for your attention. And I thank Diane again.
Hi. So we had a lecture come in last week, Dr. Rubinovitz, and his presentation was on the Holocaust from the Israeli perspective, and a point that he had was that every year the qualifications or the parameters for who a survivor is getting larger and larger. And your point about how every survivor is also in some way a rescuer reminded me of this, and so I was wondering, do you think that if the classification of survivors increases, so too should the classification for who is a rescuer should increase?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think, I'm not Armenian. And I hesitate to define whom they consider survivor or whom they would consider a rescuer. However, one thing I can say is that I think it's become more common, and I think, in my opinion, correctly so, to not limit survivors to the actual generation that went through the genocide, and that more and more people who are second and third generation also refer to themselves as survivors. Because the trauma of the genocide and of the Holocaust is passed down. And I think the expansion of the term survivor in that sense is also being supported through psychological studies as well. So in that sense, I think the who's considered a survivor, yes, is expanding. And look, there is, and along those same lines, so that would be horizontally, or sorry, vertically. Horizontally also, there's always a question where your family didn't actually go through it, right? Because, I don't know, they were here. They already left in, let's say, 1890, and they came to the United States. Are they survivors? And I would also, again, say yes. I mean, there is a collective memory, but there are also plenty of stories here of people writing to find out what's going on with their families in the Ottoman Empire, and they're not getting any response. They have to deal with the refugee problem when they come here. So if you're a relative and all of a sudden, your cousin shows up on at your doorstep and you have to give him a place to stay, should you then also be classified as a rescuer? Even if it's here, by giving them a place to live and maybe their first job. There are people marry, right? And this is very common. There are two people who are stranded after the genocide, and the church moves to get them married and bring them here so that they can rebuild. There's a huge emphasis, I have to say this, huge emphasis in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, and here and in Lebanon and in the diaspora, of rebuilding, and a huge emphasis placed on family. Right, so that and you get a lot of these cartoons. I don't mean cartoon pictures or pictures of, Armenian men with a gun, with a woman beside him, and a young child. And I'm sure this is probably very similar to the pioneer literature that you get in Israel as well, and that the new Armenian in some ways is both a hearkening back to an older Armenian, but is also a different one. But it is going to be based on the family and based on a certain amount of strength. So in terms of increasing the definition of who a rescuer is, yeah, I think it inevitably does have to grow. I don't know if we want to get it to such a point where both terms then become meaningless, right? That's always the problem. If everyone's a rescuer, nobody is. But I think we can have different understandings of what it means. I mean, there are those people who, risked themselves to hide Armenians during the genocide. And then there are those people who provided support and a family life and and a job after the survivors got to wherever they were. And in some ways, those are also rescuers. Anybody who makes sure that none of those people were lost at any point in their life is a rescuer. Because there's so many junctures at which, it's unbelievable to think about what they went through and everything that they lost. And to think that they could even keep going on and not just give up and just say that, the world sucks. And and you're looking at it, and for them, it does. You couldn't blame anybody for just saying, look, the world abandoned us and basically let us out to dry. Why should we be doing anything? So anybody who stopped anyone from going to that point too is in some sense a rescuer, but it's a different category. I'm sure this is a discussion, as I said, they're having right now at the Armenian Genocide Museum. It's a discussion they're having amongst academics. Whom do we count? And it's being done in conversation with what's going on at Yad Vashem and how Jews are reacting to this and whom they're defining. So I think it's like most things. I'm not big on definitions. What I like are conversations. And this is something that's going to have to be continuously renegotiated in some ways, and it's going to be different for each generation, and it's going to be different for each group of people. And there's not going to be, well, this is what a survivor is, and this is what a rescuer is, and that's it. That'll never work. In the same way that you can never even say, like, this is what an Armenian is, or this is what a Jew is. That's not going to work. These are constantly changing terms. I mean, they're going to be obviously general parameters that fit, but it's going to be something that requires re-examination. That's a good thing, to require that re-examination and to look at again and again these stories and what happened. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
A couple of years ago, maybe my memory isn't that clear because of stroke, but over in Sonoma, the town of Sonoma, they had a film festival, and they had a full-length feature film with real actors, really good actors, and it covered this whole subject, very dramatic. I can't remember the name of it, but you might know that, and you did a very good presentation all the way through. They just covered the history, and it's worth seeing if it's still around somewhere. Does anyone happen to know what the name of that was? Yeah, I think so. Okay.
That one has to go off. A number of films that have come out and that are continuing to come out about it. The Promise, I would say, is probably the biggest one that's come out recently. But there have been other films, and people are still making them. Film is an incredible medium to use because it does bring graphically to life, things that we can't even imagine, and so it is, I think, an important move that's done. But it's also, I think, one of the challenges. It's still a work of art, and this feeds into the larger argument, of which Adorno really raised. Can there be art after genocide? Really, I mean, this whole issue of whether you can still have beauty after genocide, after something that horrendous happens. Can you really look at things and say there's still something beautiful? And I think that's still a challenge, particularly when depicting atrocities like the Holocaust, the genocide, what happened in Rwanda. Because I think a work of art, still needs to have that aesthetic element to it. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be beautiful, and it doesn't have to be a nice story or anything like that. But I think it is a challenge, and it's one that I think will continue to attract also filmmakers, because it is a challenge and because there is a powerful message. And so I hope that people will continue to resolve one of the things I don't like about genocide studies, and I'll just say it, is it deals with destruction. And I'm not really particularly interested in destruction. I'm interested in creation and what Armenians have done and what they write and what they build, what they paint, not how they were beaten up. That doesn't interest me in and of itself. And yeah. But I think that remains the challenge when you're dealing with this subject, and when you're thinking about that, even as a matter of part of the culture. How do you square that circle of the entire elimination of a people and of a culture, and still moving forward and making a new culture and civilization that, yes, draws from its past, and somehow is also able to derive energy from what is ultimately a black hole. And that can only be up to the actual survivors today to figure out. It'll only happen over time. I have nothing to say about that. It's not my personal history. I just know that it's a difficult challenge. But I have to say, the younger generation, I think, is making great strides. And when you talk to younger Armenian Americans, and how they see their culture going forward, I get very positive feelings. And I think really, Armenians' best times are still ahead. It may not seem like it right now, but I think it may be. Thank you very much. Thank you.